3 days after the election, we still don't know the outcome of several significant races, and some may be nearing a recount. One of the closest is for the Senate seat in Florida. Democratic incumbent Senator Bill Nelson has closed the gap between him and Republican candidate Governor Rick Scott to just under 15,000 votes. An automatic machine recount would occur if the margin holds at less than 0.5%. There's also a tight race for the Florida governor's house. Democratic candidate Mayor Andrew Gillum conceded on Tuesday, but now he could be heading to a recount in his race against Republican candidate Ron DeSantis. Earlier today, President Trump was asked if he sees the federal government playing a role in a potential Florida recount.
If you look at Broward and Palm Beach to a lesser extent, if you look at Broward County, they have had a horrible history. And if you look at the person, in this case a woman, involved, she has had a horrible history. And all of a sudden, they're finding votes out of nowhere. And Rick Scott, who won by, it was close, but he won by a comfortable margin. Every couple of hours, it goes down a little bit.
The president later tweeted, quote, "Don't worry, Florida, I am sending much better lawyers to expose the fraud." CBS News political correspondent Ed O'Keefe joins us now from our Washington bureau. So, Ed, the president said, and I'm quoting here, about Broward County has a horrible history. This is the president's words. And then in a later tweet, he called this the Broward effect. He singled out, in particular, Brenda Snipes, who is the supervisor of elections there. Does the president have evidence to back up what he's claiming here?
Well, he doesn't necessarily have evidence, but there is a history of Broward County having difficulty counting votes. This goes back, of course, to 18 years ago this week, when the 2000 presidential recount began in Florida and problems were exposed there in Broward County. There have been some questions raised since election night about the tabulation of ballots, about where exactly they ended up, about why it is that it's taken so long. The bottom line is this. By noon Saturday, all of Florida's counties have to have reported their tabulations, and state officials will then look and see, is the difference 0.5% or less between Rick Scott and Bill Nelson? And if it is, then they will proceed to a machine recount, where they'll basically count everything again automatically. And if then it comes in even less, if there's a difference of less than 0.14 or 0.25% between the candidates, which is possible, just given the, anything's possible these days, then they'd have to count all the ballots by hand. And so we could potentially be looking at something that will stretch into December, much like it did back in 2000 when the Bush v. Gore race stretched until nearly Christmas. And, of course, what's different now is that it's been 18 years. So I think there's a lot of frustration down there in Florida about why is it that something like this could still be happening. And you put that up against a far more politically charged time and an incredibly expensive, high-profile race involving two people who desperately want that seat, plus a president who's keeping close tabs on it because he's obsessed with the state's politics, and it makes for a potentially toxic brew.
So, Ed, when the president said that he's sending lawyers, do we know what he was hinting at there?
We don't. And at this point, there's no reason for federal intervention. If the president's campaign itself is interested in this and wants to help out Rick Scott and Florida Republicans, that would be within their right. And we'll see whether or not that happens.
Last night, at a press conference, Governor Rick Scott declared that he would take every legal action possible. I'm going to play a bite for you.
Every person in Florida knows exactly what is happening. Their goal is to keep mysteriously finding more votes until the election turns out the way they want. And when that fails, they will file a bunch of lawsuits in order to try to overturn the will of the voters. Tonight, I'm asking the Florida Department of Law Enforcement to investigate this immediately, and I am considering every single legal option available. No ragtag group of liberal activists or lawyers from D.C. will be allowed to steal this election from the voters in this great state.
So has Senator Nelson or Mayor Gillum responded to the governor?
Through his lawyer, Senator Nelson essentially suggests that the governor is desperate by suggesting now that he'll take all legal action necessary. But, of course, Senator Nelson has also lawyered up to make sure that all the votes are counted. So either way, this is heading into a court challenge this afternoon in Broward County, and we could expect to possibly see some more legal challenges to this if either side has concerns. As for Andrew Gillum, all he said via tweet last night was just let every vote be counted, Mr. Governor, and see where this goes. He has been far less active and vocal about this situation than Nelson. Unclear why that is, although the math is more in favor of Nelson, given that he is closer right now to Rick Scott than Gillum is to DeSantis. But if anyone needed a reminder that every vote really does make a difference, I think Florida is yet again proving it to us. Of course, there are concerns that every vote will be counted. We'll see about that. But certainly this is a reminder that turnout really does matter.
Ed, is there anything that you can point to that can explain why Florida and its electorate seems to be especially susceptible to these close races?
Oh, Rena, how much time do we have? Look, they just have a history. They have a history, especially this century, of close races in virtually every big statewide race, whether it's a presidential contest, whether it's a governor's race, whether it's a Senate race. Rick Scott has never won a statewide race with more than 2% of the vote. He's not going to do it in this case either. Nelson has won in the past by more comfortable margins, and he's running into what has become a trend in statewide Florida politics, which is just simply close races. And so we'll see here, again, what the ultimate margin is. But this just speaks to the fact that given its transient nature, given that it is a state that actively participates in its politics, and also given that this is a state with a growing number of no-party affiliation voters, or people who don't register with either one, which means that, in essence, both parties can put up candidates that could win over that third of the voting population. It leads to tight races and keeps things interesting for those of us who have to cover politics.
It's one of my favorite states to watch every election season. But before I let you go, though, I want to turn quickly to Georgia. The president tweeting this morning, he said that Brian Kemp ran a great race in Georgia and he won. It's time to move on. We know Stacey Abrams would argue otherwise. Where does this race stand?
Well, what Stacey Abrams is hoping for at this point is that instead of it saying 50% on that board right there, that it says at the most 49.9%, because state law requires in a governor's race that somebody get at least 50% of the vote in order to win. If it's anything below that, there will be a December 4th recount. So Abrams, much like the Democrats down in Florida, is waiting for every ballot to be counted before declaring her intentions. And if for some reason those numbers slip just below 50%, by state law, there will be a recount. We will see there what happens. What Kemp has done, remember, he's the now former Secretary of State, which oversees state elections. He has quit that job, he says, to focus on preparing to become governor. The irony in that, perhaps the insult to the injury for Stacey Abrams, is that throughout the campaign, she was pushing for him to at least temporarily recuse himself from that office and not oversee the state elections since he was on the ballot. He didn't do that, and now he has.
Our Ed O'Keefe, political correspondent for CBS News. Ed, thank you very much.